In the last week of its summer session, Israel's parliament has passed the so-called Breaking the Silence law, named after the prominent left-wing anti-occupation group. The new law states that extreme organisations that operate to humiliate and demean IDF soldiers will not be able to enter schools and meet with students. Our diplomatic correspondent Eli breaks down more on what those on the right-hand side of the aisle are saying, and they're hailing as an end to anti-Israel propaganda, and what makes the left warn of an end to Israeli democracy.
Breaking up. The disputed NGO Breaking the Silence can no longer enter Israeli schools. The Israeli parliament passed a law on Tuesday allowing the education minister, currently hawkish leader Naftali Bennett, to, quote, prescribe rules for the prevention of any activity in an educational institution by any person or external body who is in serious and significant contradiction to the objectives of the state's education. But more specifically, it is aimed at diminishing the activity of Breaking the Silence, an organization that collects and publishes testimonies from former IDF soldiers on alleged violations of Palestinian rights in the West Bank. They have been accused of assisting anti-Israeli activities in efforts to boycott the Jewish state.
Our target is not the army. Our target is the policy of continuing the occupation. We are part of the army. We believe that the army is being used for a purpose that is not defending the country. And about poisoning kids, we're talking about their future. Those kids, in about a year after, gonna do the things that I did in the army. Doesn't they deserve the small decency to know what they're about to do?
Education Minister Naftali Bennett, who co-sponsored the bill, hailed the decision, saying, quote,
"The reality in which organizations that undermine the legitimacy of the state of Israel and slander IDF soldiers will seep into Israeli students is over today. As long as they work abroad against the state of Israel and the IDF, I will not allow their activities in the education system."
Breaking the Silence, for their part, say that
this attempt to shut up those who open their mouths will not be able to conceal the occupation from the students, but it proves how much Bennett and his friends are afraid of their own ideology. It is time for Bennett and his friends to understand that as long as there is occupation, there will also be soldiers who will break a silence to reveal what we have been doing in the territories for 51 years. Want us to shut up? End the occupation.
And Ellie joins me in studio, along with attorney and senior editor at Media Monitor Honest Reporting, Daniel Pomerantz. Great to have you both with us.
Thanks for having us.
Dan, we'll get you to kick us off. I suppose looking at the ethics of this bill, is this hampering free speech? Is this stopping propaganda? What's happening here?
Well, you know, there's a difference between free speech, which is the freedom to say what you want, versus obligating someone to give you a platform. And in no country are you obligated to give person access to public schools. For example, in the United States, there was a case, Edwards versus Aguilar, in 1987. It was creationists who wanted to go into schools and preach that Darwin is wrong and God created everything and the earth is 5,000 years old. They sued in the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said you can say what you want, but you can't force schools to give you their students as a platform.
So what are these groups saying, Ellie, that they need to be stopped?
Well, the thing with Breaking the Silence is that they're actively working abroad, and perhaps this is what ticks off many of Israel's politicians. It's not just they're working here domestically, but they're taking it outside. You know, they're not keeping it here indoors and trying to fix things, but using it as some sort of a mechanism to slander Israel abroad. And this is, again, I think, the core of the issue for many politicians. And also, we always need to ask ourselves, why is a bill being promoted politically speaking? And as you mentioned, we're at the final week of the summer session, so they're really eager to make as many bonus points vis-a-vis their electoral bases as possible, and this is yet another case of it. But again, not just from the right wing. Many, both in the center and the left side of the political map, disagree with the actions of Breaking the Silence.
Can I add something to that? A watchdog group is very important, whether it's over the army, police, government, whatever. But in this particular case, Breaking the Silence gets 65% of its funding from foreign governments. They get bonuses for putting IDF soldiers in jail. And last November, their spokesman, Dean Iskaroff, was caught in court lying in order to try and get IDF soldiers
Sure,
put
but
in
how
prison.
are the messages of these groups any more like propaganda than the messages coming from right-wing groups?
Well, these groups, first of all, are working for foreign governments, and they're working specifically for the purpose of putting soldiers in prison. And they they aren't acting as a watchdog group should. Now, whether a right-wing watchdog group or a left-wing watchdog group can play a valuable role, but this particular group isn't actually acting as one, which is a shame, because watchdog groups in general are an important part of our democracy, but breaking the silence just is a bad example.
All right, Ellie, to another bill passed in Israel's parliament before, which is transferring the jurisdiction over administrative petitions filed by Palestinians in the West Bank, moving it from Israel's High Court of Justice to the Jerusalem District Court. What does this mean in practice?
Well, two things that are important to note here. First of all, it means some sort of normalization to West Bank settlements. Me, as a citizen of Israel who's living in outside of the West Bank, I have a process of appeals, the regional court, et cetera, but every complaint there goes straight to the Supreme Court. So it's some sort of, again, normalization of the status there. Second of all, it's the issue of the Supreme Court. We are seeing the current Justice Minister, as well as many other politicians, again, from the right side of the political map, talking a lot about the judicial activism and trying to create a new balance between the judicial establishment and lawmakers. And this is perceived as yet another step to somewhat undermine the clout of the Supreme Court for the sake of the lawmakers, elected representatives at the end of the day.
This issue has been way too politicized. You've got people on the left saying it's bad for Palestinians, and you've got people on the right saying it's good for settlers. The truth is, any case in the district court can still be appealed to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court still has the power to accept whatever appeals it wants. All that we've changed is that instead of all cases going directly to the Supreme Court, they go to what's called a court of original jurisdiction, which is the way cases usually work.
Is that not a spin? Does this not undermine the Palestinians when they have to go to court to file for these petitions?
I think both on the right and the left, people want to believe that because it supports both of their cases. In reality, I think it's a little bit of rhetoric over substance. At the end of the day, Palestinians have recourse to the district court, and if they're not happy with the decision, they can still appeal to the Supreme Court, and if the Supreme Court really is being activist, they can choose to accept all those appeals.
All right, Ellie Ockenberg, Dan Pomerantz, appreciate that insight and analysis.